This is Mr. Gillum, and today we're going to solve some equations again, two-steppers. We've done it before in the past, and we're going to do it some more today, but now we're going to actually identify the properties we're using as we go. Alright, so we're going to take a look at the properties and identify what we're doing, why we're doing it. We're going to start with this basic equation, 4x minus 12 equals negative 8. I'm going to change colors for each property that I use. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and underline this in blue. I'm going to say this is the given. And I think we might need more columns for as many steps as we're going to need here. So I'm going to go ahead and change to light blue now. And if I wanted to solve this equation, the first step that I would take is I would add 12 to both sides. I'd add 12 to both sides. And so when I do that, that is the addition property of equality. The addition property of equality. Alright, now go to yellow here. I'm going to write it out here. 4x minus 12 plus 12 equals negative 8 plus 12. And I'm going to go ahead and simplify, but I'm not going to call it simplifying because something special happens here. When I do negative 12 plus 12, it gives me 4x plus 0. They're additive inverses. I'm going to go ahead and simplify this at the same time. Call that 4. So now I have 4x plus 0 equals 4. And that was the additive inverse property. And we'll go to a different color here, and I'm going to have to squeeze this in here. I'm actually going to write it off to the left. 4x plus 0 is 4x. So I'm going to simplify that and say 4x equals 4. I guess I didn't need to write that off to the side because it's right there in front of me. It gives me, when I add 0 to it, 4x still. That's actually called the identity property of addition. It's the property when you add 0 to something, then it doesn't change. Do you need me for something? Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. After that, we know that the next thing to do to solve this equation would be to divide both sides by 4. And I'm going to leave it just like that, and that's the division property of equality. And when I divide something by itself, or I multiply by its inverse, it is called the multiplicative inverse property. So when I divide the 4 by 4, I just have x, just one x, equals 1. This guy is like multiplying. 4 times 1/4 or 4 divided by 4 are the same thing. So we're going to call that the multiplicative inverse property. Alright, and then my last color here, we'll go back to, we'll just do that one right there. X equals 1. So I've got my answer. And that's just called simplifying. Actually, we don't even need to put that. We just leave it as multiplicative inverse property. Okay, so a lot of different properties are happening that maybe you didn't realize. So we're going to actually label them today and practice labeling them. It's going to show me that you know which property you're using. So let's just start off again with the given. It's the given problem. And the first thing I would need to do to solve this problem is subtract 7 from both sides. So I'm using I'm actually going to change that to a different color. I'm using darn it. There we go. Okay. I'm using the subtraction property of equality. Alright, now when that happens, and I'm actually putting them together on this part, I'm adding opposites. So I'm going to call this next step, as I simplify, x over 5 plus 0 equals 1. I'm going to call that additive inverse. When I add opposites and they add up to 0, it's called the additive inverse property. So that part specifically. And then we have anything plus 0 equals 1. So as I simplify this, when I add 0 to something, I get to this guy, x over 5 equals 1. X over 5 plus 0 is still x over 5. That's called the addition or identity property of addition. The identity property of addition. Well, I'm almost done now. This problem's almost solved. I'm going to go ahead and multiply both sides by 5. And when I do that, actually, believe it or not, this is going to say this is the multiplication property of equality. But what I'm actually doing is I am multiplying by the reciprocal. 5 over 1 times x over 5. 5 and 1/5 are reciprocals, or inverses. So when I actually simplify this to x equals 5, or what the answer is, what I did was I multiplied inverses, so the multiplicative inverse property. Alright, so we got a lot of different properties for each one of these examples. Now let's throw a little distributing in here. Love me some distributed property. Okay, so we're going to start with the given. We got some more steps this time. And this time I'm going to start by distributing. And the whole negative gets distributed to both parts. So I'm taking negative 2 times x. I'm taking negative 2 times negative 15. Okay, and that was the distributive property. Alright, so I distributed to both parts, and that took me all the way down to here. And so now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start solving my equation. So once again, I'm going to subtract 30 from both sides. That part itself is called the subtraction property of equality. And as I'm simplifying here, what happens when I add inverses, or when I add opposites, is the additive inverse property. And so we move on. And when I'm adding 0 to something and it's not changing, to get me here, that is called the identity property. It's keeping its identity. And it's of addition. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by negative 2. The division property of equality. Property of equality. And when I'm dividing, that's really the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. 1 over negative 2 times negative 2x over 1. As you can see, these are reciprocals here. So they're just one fraction flipped over. So when I reduce this guy right here and I get to my final answer, there is some simplifying involved, but this guy itself is called the multiplicative inverse property. It tells me it's just going to leave me with 1 when I multiply negative 2 and negative 1/2, or when I divide negative 2 by negative 2. Alright, so I just want to do one more with you. Once again, we're going to start out with the given problem, which is just the original, and I'm going to go ahead and distribute. So I'm going to take this guy times both parts. I'm going to take negative 1/2 times 4x. Half of 4 is 2. Negative 2x. Negative times a negative is a positive, so I'm going to say plus 15 equals negative 7. Ooh, see here, is that right? Yes, I think that actually got left off there, that negative 7. So that was the distributive property. Alright, and so let's take a look at the next part here. As I go to solve my problem here, the next thing I would do is subtract 15 from both sides. So that's the subtraction property of equality. And when I'm adding inverses right here, I should change colors. I'll just do a nice bright color so I can write over that. As I'm adding inverses, or adding opposites, that is the inverse property of addition. It tells me that opposites add together to make 0. The identity property tells me that when I add negative 2x and 0 together, I just get negative 2x. Identity, nothing changes there. And then I have a nice gray color. We're going to move it over here a little bit so we can see. When I divide both sides by negative 2, that's going to say division property. But when I divide something that the product or the result is 1, what I really have here to get to my final answer, which should be not 4, but it should be 11, is this guy right here. When I'm dividing, I'm getting 1x. That is called the let's see here, multiplicative inverse property. And that just says if I take -2 divided by -2, it equals 1, or it says the same thing, -2 times -1/2 equals 1, either way. Okay, dividing by -2 and multiplying by 1/2 are the same thing. So we're going to call it the multiplicative inverse property of equality. Alright, so we practiced some of these properties and what they look like. So hopefully when we're doing these little templates and this little worksheet that I have for you, you know which properties to use and where to identify them at. That's it for today.